One of the first cases I was given as a homicide detective was probably the easiest open and shut case of my career in terms of determining if there was an actual guilty party. But it also happened to be one of the most haunting things I'd ever come across in my entire life. It started out as a woman calling 911 to say her husband had set himself on fire. EMTs show up, he gets taken to the hospital, but is announced dead on arrival. Given that she was the last person to see him alive, I'm given the task of exploring if there was any possibility that the wife had actually killed him. This was ruled out as almost right away, as the wife had dashcam footage of the whole thing going down. As part of the investigation, I had to watch this footage, and my God, it was one of the worst things I'd ever seen. I'll break down the whole scenario for you so you have some context. According to the guy's wife, her husband used to start work much earlier than she did, and they only had time for a brief good morning and goodbye before he headed off to his job. By the time she got up for some coffee, he was usually just finishing off his breakfast, but on the morning of his death, he'd already left their home by the time she got downstairs. Although such an occurrence wasn't exactly cause for alarm, she found it kind of unusual. But then she sees his company ID just lying there on a countertop, and without it, he wouldn't even be permitted to enter the building to commence work. So, instead of waiting for him to drive all the way back, apparently his commute was just shy of an hour, she figured that she'd drive all the way to his place of work to get his ID to him so he wouldn't be too late starting work. She then puts her shoes and a coat on, gets in her car, then starts driving off in the direction of her husband's workplace. She says she was calling him a bunch during the drive, but at no point did he answer his phone. Then, about a third of the way into the drive, she spots a car that looks suspiciously like her husband's, parked off a path at the side of the highway. The path is flanked by trees, so she can't see her husband, only what she believed to be his car. She then turns around at the next available opportunity, doubles back, then turns down the pathway which I believe led to some kind of dairy or poultry farm. It's here that the relevant section of her dashcam recording begins. I remember watching as the dashcam shows her approaching her husband's car. She then honks her horn, and a man we later identified as being her husband basically steps out from behind a tree. She then opens the driver's side door, calling out his name and asking what he was doing. Her husband says nothing in return and appears to be fiddling with something that was in his hands. She then asks again, "What are you doing?" Only that time, there was considerably more stress in her voice, suggesting that she could see what he had in his hand. The man continues to stay silent, and the next thing you see on the dashcam recording is the guy being engulfed in flames. Her screams are still probably the most horrific sound I'd ever heard during my career as a police officer, just full of terror and confusion. She rushes towards him for a second, then stops, runs back to the car, then reappears on the dashcam footage with a blanket. She tried to use the blanket to douse the flames burning up her husband, and in the end, she was successful. But the damage was done, and his injuries were so severe that he didn't survive the ride to the hospital. As you can imagine, that was all extremely disturbing to witness, for me and, obviously, her. After that, the whole thing was out of my hands, as obviously no homicide had taken place. But there were a few small details I managed to pick up before the case was closed that I still find very, very unsettling. The first was that the husband seemed to have no reason whatsoever to want to take his own life. The family's finances were in good health. Their kids were doing great in school. Their son was headed for a football scholarship at one of our state's top colleges. And from what I heard, their marital relationship was about as healthy as could possibly be. The husband had no history of depression or anything like that. His personal and professional lives seemed to be in great condition. In short, the reasons as to why he might self-immolate like that were a complete mystery. Naturally, we didn't look into it too much, not us homicide guys anyway, but there was one other little thing that the wife told us as we were closing the investigation that I think might just be the key to finding out what was going on in the guy's head. A few days before the guy set himself on fire, his wife went up into their office to find that he'd taken the family computer away. Not just the tower either, the whole thing. Monitor, mouse, keyboard, speakers, everything. When she asked him about it, he just told her it needed replacing, that they could use a newer, more up-to-date model. This newer model arrived within a few days of the old one disappearing, so the wife didn't think anything of it. She did think it was kind of odd that he didn't just leave the old one in place until the replacement arrived, but she just assumed that the old one was unworkable, and then by the time the new one arrived, the whole thing was forgotten about. It seems to me that the key to finding out why this guy took his own life is buried somewhere on that old computer's hard drive. And unless the wife manages to find out what the guy did with it, possibly recovering the hard drive in the process, the whole thing is going to remain a very unsettling mystery for all involved. I was a homicide detective working just outside of Portland, Oregon for just over 7 years. I think a cop only has so much time in them as murder police, as they call it, like a little hourglass or something. Once you run out of stomach for it, you gotta get out. And this is the case that made me throw in the towel. In late spring of 1983, we had a woman bring her 3 kids to the hospital, and all 3 had gunshot wounds. One of them was already dead, and the other 2 definitely would have been if it wasn't for the efforts of the doctors and nurses over at Mackenzie Willamette. When we heard about it, we were all amazed at how brave and resilient the mom had been. She'd been shot in the arm during what she told us was an attempted carjacking, but had managed to fight the guy off before driving her kids to the hospital. As she sped off, the guy had apparently fired shots at the back of her car, and that's how her kids ended up getting hit. Myself and my partner drove down to the hospital right away, hoping to ask her some questions so we could get after her kid's killer before it was too late. She seemed pretty calm for someone that had just lost one of their kids to a carjacker's bullets, but we figured whatever painkillers she'd been given had that kind of effect on her. But after that, the inconsistencies really started to add up. The first was when one of the woman's nurses pulled us aside after we'd questioned her. The nurse told us that the woman, whose name was Diane, had reacted very, very strangely upon being told that 2 of her 3 kids were going to survive their wounds. Any other mother would have been elated, even if they were drugged up to the eyeballs. But Diane barely seemed to react. She just said okay and then seemed to withdraw inside of herself like she was in deep thought. The second thing was when we got the results of the forensic examination on her car. Diane said the carjacker had shot her at point-blank range, right in the arm, while she was sitting in the driver's seat. But then there was no blood spray on the driver's side at all. She also mentioned how the carjacker had fired on the back of her car as she sped away, but our ballistics experts said that the bullet holes didn't line up with how the kids actually got hit. To them, it was almost like she'd staged the whole thing. Obviously, we had some rather serious questions to pose to Diane during our second interview, but before the day came, we were contacted by a man who said he needed to talk to us. When we met with the guy, he said that he and Diane had been having an affair over the past year or so, and that after he tried to break it off with her, she threatened to kill his wife so that they could be together. He said that he was actually scared for his life too at one point, and that the whole thing had forced him to come clean to his wife so that he could get her to a place of safety until Diane moved back to Oregon. When he mentioned how serious Diane seemed to have been with her threats, he brought up how she'd talked about buying a gun, and that she'd even showed it to him. That is what prompted us to search Diane's house, and while we didn't actually find any kind of firearm, we did find a few .22 caliber shell casings she attempted to dispose of in her garage. And guess what size bullet the kids had been shot with? You guessed it, .22s. It took us almost a whole year to get all the evidence we needed to guarantee a conviction, but we got there in the end. Our chief of police wanted us to be 100% certain that we could convince a jury of Diane's guilt, but by the time the trial came, we didn't need to. One of Diane's own kids did all the heavy lifting for us. Her eldest daughter, who survived being shot, actually took the stand to describe how her mother had shot her little brother and sister before shooting herself in the arm to make her story look legit. The other thing I remember about Diane's trial is how the defense had a list of mental disorders that she'd suffered from that was about as long as your arm, and they tried to use them to get a reduced sentence on the grounds that she wasn't in control of herself. That didn't wash with us, and it didn't wash with the judge or jury either, and she ended up getting life in prison plus 50 years. Weirdly enough, Diane ended up having another kid around the same time she was sentenced, although I couldn't tell you exactly who the father was. The kid ended up getting adopted, and then long after I quit being a homicide detective, my ex-wife calls me to say that she'd appeared on Oprah and had talked about what it was like having someone like that for a mother. I didn't watch the interview, but just the mention of it had all these bad memories rushing back to me. As a parent, the idea of my kids getting hurt makes me feel physically sick. Even now that they're all grown up, and the idea of actually hurting them myself isn't something I can even imagine being capable of doing. The darkness in that woman's heart, seeing those kids all torn up, watching her lie over and over again about neglecting her primary duty as a mother. They all constituted the last few grains of sand in the hourglass of my time working homicide. I handed in my transfer request on the day Diane was convicted, and although I had to work one more case before it actually went through, my captain and my fellow detectives knew better than to give any more tough cases to someone who had reached their limit and was mentally checked out. And eventually, I ended up on the fraud team. I have nothing but respect for cops that choose to work homicide, and I admire any detectives who manage to last longer than I did. But for me personally, there was only so much that I could take. I have a story to tell you, a very frightening one at that, but it comes with a little disclaimer. It's not exactly my story. It's my grandfather's, who was the single most fascinating man I'd ever known. He was definitely a little kooky towards the end of his life because he became obsessed with the JFK assassination and the conspiracy theories surrounding it. But then, by the end of the story, I'm pretty sure you'll understand why. So I was brought up in Austin, but my grandfather was raised in Houston, and for most of his adult life, he worked as a detective for the homicide division of the Houston Police Department. He always used to say that being murder police, as he used to put it, was somehow both the most rewarding occupation he could possibly envision for himself, but also something he wouldn't wish on his worst enemies. Getting bloodthirsty killers off the streets so they could ride the lightning was something he found very fulfilling. And although that might sound equally as bloodthirsty, he only had to hear one or two accounts of some of the more gruesome things that he'd witnessed to lose all sympathy for those that ended up strapped into Old Sparky. But one story topped all the others in terms of how jaw-droppingly horrifying it was, and not only that, but the far-reaching implications of it made it one that gives me shivers to even think about, even all these years later. Full disclosure, I've done a bit of research on the exact dates and details, just to give you a clearer idea of what actually happened, and so you can cross-reference the events themselves so you know that this all actually happened. In June of 1965, 2 Houston PD officers received orders to perform a welfare check at the home of Fred and Edwina Rogers, a middle-aged couple who lived in an area of Houston called Montrose. Neither of the Rogers neighbors had heard from them in a few days, and a relative of the couple had become so concerned that he'd asked the cops to check on them, just in case anything had happened. After that, the cops drove over, knocking on the door and peeking through the windows, but nothing seemed amiss. Thankfully, the cops had the good sense to actually break into the house, just to make sure everything was okay. But then once they were inside, nothing looked remotely out of place, and the whole house looked basically untouched and peaceful. The only thing that alerted them to there being anything wrong was the fact that the kitchen table had been set and laid for some kind of dinner. The way I imagine it, it was almost like that old ghost ship, the Mary Celeste, or the old Roanoke ghost town, It looked like whoever lived there had just packed up and disappeared all of a sudden, real fast too, without having collected anything or brought anything along. The whole mealtime thing must have put an idea into one of the officers' heads because he then started checking the home's refrigerator. He opens the door, looks inside, then sees all these cuts of meat stacked in neat little piles on the shelves, and he later said they looked almost exactly like cuts of pork. He's probably thinking this was some of the meat the Rogers were going to eat for whatever meal they seemed to have bailed on. But right then, just as the cop is closing the fridge door over, he sees something that has his jaw practically hitting the floor in absolute horror. Inside the 2 glass vegetable bins at the bottom of the fridge are 2 decapitated human heads. The heads of Fred and Edwina Rogers. And the meat on the shelves, it wasn't pork. It was the remains of their arms, legs, and torsos after someone had butchered them. The couple's organs were later found in a nearby sewer, meaning whoever had cut them up must have flushed their insides down the toilet. Other parts of their bodies, like their eyes and their private parts, were never found, suggesting their killer had either taken them as trophies or had eaten them during the process of butchering their bodies. I guess psychopathic killers get hungry too, right? The cop's best guess was that the Rogers had been killed around June 20th, so Father's Day. Fred's autopsy showed that he'd been beaten to death with a claw hammer before his eyes and junk had been gouged out, probably with the same hammer he was killed with. Edwina, on the other hand, she got much luckier and died right away from a single gunshot to the head. What comes next is really gruesome, I know, but it's where this part of the story gets very, very interesting. Even though the bathtub upstairs had been thoroughly cleaned, the cops figured out that it had been used by the killer to cut up the bodies. But then whoever had actually done the butchering must have known quite a bit about how human bodies were put together, because they managed to do it without absolutely any waste of flesh or meat aside from organs. By that I mean they'd either butchered a person before, they had tons of experience butchering pigs, so they at least had some idea of how to do it, or they were some sort of medical professional who specialized in human anatomy, either a coroner or whoever does autopsies after a person has died. The only trace of blood the cops could find led to the bedroom of the Rogers' son, Charles, meaning he'd either been the 3rd murder victim or he'd been the one responsible for murdering his parents. Either way, he had to be found, and that's partly where Grandpa stepped in. The case ended up getting taken away from him not long after, and my grandpa said his superiors told him it was because they had evidence that Rogers had fled into Central America, which meant it was basically up to the federal government to bring him home. But then get this, and note, this is all from memory, and I have no real way of verifying any of this apart from a few details here and there, so you just have to take mine and Grandpa's word for it. A few weeks before the case gets moved up to the Fed, Grandpa and his partner found out that Rogers used to live down in Mexico City, working as a seismologist for some big oil company. They managed to track down one of the guys he used to work with down there, who said that Charles was basically a genius for finding oil and gas deposits. When they were down in Mexico City, they were responsible for securing contracts for Shell to harvest oil and gas down there. But Charles used to go AWOL all the time, and keeping him on task was apparently like herding cats, as my grandpa used to put it. This one time, Charles told his ex-coworker that he was going to meet a friend at some bar in this particular neighborhood of Mexico City. He said that he'd only be an hour or two, and then they could get back to work. But then way more time goes by, and they're burning daylight on company money, so the guy goes looking for Charles at the place that he said that he was meeting his friend. When the guy gets there, Charles is nowhere to be seen, and this makes the guy really mad, so he goes looking around this neighborhood, asking the locals if they've seen some gringo matching Charles' description. Eventually, he finds Charles, and he's all like, "Yo, man, we gotta get back to work." Only, Charles seems really spooked that he's been found, and immediately excuses himself from the meeting with his friend. But then as they're walking away, the friend calls after Charles, only he doesn't call him Charles at all. He calls him Lee. Why would Charles be going around Mexico City telling people that his name is Lee of all things? Well, according to his ex-coworker, Charles said that the friend that he was drinking with was an old college roomie and that Lee was a nickname, as in Char Lee. The ex-coworker thinks that this is kind of weird, but buys the explanation and only brings it up because he figured that he might have run off with the help of these old college friends who might be sheltering him in Mexico City, in which case they'd be calling him Lee and not Charles. It made sense. But just in case he might be hiding out anywhere else, my grandpa and his partner check around just to make sure Charles didn't have any connections anywhere else. I mean, he obviously did. He used to be a Navy pilot during World War II, so he had old Navy buddies all over the country. But then my grandpa discovered that for almost a whole year, Charles was living in Dallas, apparently while remaining completely unemployed. So from Christmas of 1962 to the end of November in 1963, Charles was living in Dallas, not collecting a penny in welfare, and with no record of him being employed by any major oil or gas company. After getting a hold of a copy of a rental agreement he'd signed with the landlord, my grandpa was able to determine that Charles had left Dallas on November 24th of 1963. Suddenly, at least in my grandpa's eyes, it all started to fall into place. Charles had left Dallas just 2 days after President Kennedy was assassinated, and he'd been calling himself Lee in certain circles while living down in Mexico City. Then, less than 2 years later, his parents wind up getting killed in a horrific way, and Charles basically drops off the face of the earth. Grandpa said that, at the time, even though it was staring him right in the face, he just didn't want to acknowledge it. It seemed like such a far-out idea that the murder of Charles's parents might be in any way connected to the JFK assassination, and besides, he and his partner would get to the bottom of things eventually, right? Wrong. Days before they were officially relieved of the case files, my grandpa and his partner started receiving anonymous tips from people which seriously complicated their investigation. Not only that, but they made absolutely no sense whatsoever. One of the more ridiculous tips was that Charles's parents were criminal fraudsters who were regularly stealing money from him via some kind of wire fraud, and that's why he'd killed them, in a fit of rage after discovering yet another series of thefts. My grandpa said he didn't buy any of it, and that he and his partner agreed that someone, for some reason, was trying to muddy the investigative waters, so to speak, shoveling dirt on Charles and his parents to overcomplicate and slow down the investigation. Then a few days later, word came down that the case was moving into the hands of the FBI, and that my grandpa and his partner would be moving on to another case. Officially speaking, that was where their involvement ended, but unofficially, my grandpa's interests in Charles Rogers' connection to the JFK assassination had only just begun. He once told me that if I asked most true crime enthusiasts, they'd tell me that Charles Rogers was already losing his mind by June of 1965, to the point where he only ever communicated with his parents by writing them notes which he slid under his bedroom door. Then, despite still being unemployed at the time of the murders, Charles would apparently get up and leave the house before dawn and would only ever return after dark, sometimes after his parents had gone to bed, meaning he was sleeping no more than 6 hours a night and basically no one knows what he was doing during this time. Then one day, Charles just went completely nuts, killed his parents, then cut them up with the intention of actually eating them. Suddenly, he comes out of his manic dissociative state, realizes what he's done, then flees to Mexico to escape justice. Makes sense, I suppose, but according to my grandpa, it's all dressed up in a way that it's supposed to make sense to the outside observer, because that's not what actually happened. This is what my grandpa told me he thinks happened. Charles was involved in the JFK assassination in some capacity, whether as an organizer or maybe as an actual shooter. He didn't actually work for the CIA, but he was definitely involved with the CIA. And after JFK was shot, his handlers basically set about erasing all traces of their plan. With Charles having been such a loyal, hard-working member of the team, they told him to leave the country. After all, They'd already set him up in Mexico City. He probably spoke Spanish. He had options. But then, for whatever reason, Charles refused to leave. Maybe he figured that because he'd served his country, he'd figured that he'd earned his right to stay in the U.S. But apparently, someone up the chain didn't agree. Maybe they knew his weak spot was his parents and may or may not have given him advanced warning about what might happen to them if he didn't leave the country or find some other way to make himself disappear. Then eventually, whoever it was made good on their threat, killed Charles' parents, then did it in a way that would distract from the wider context of their murders. After all, if the press would obsess over the gruesome details of the murder itself, so would the public, and then all the crucial background details would get lost in the sauce, so to speak. My grandpa seemed like he had it all figured out. He even had a good idea of who actually committed the murders, and that person happened to be Woody Harrelson's dad, of all people. Yeah, Woody Harrelson's dad was a hitman, which is an entire other rabbit hole, so I won't touch on that, and you can do your own reading on that 100% true story. Yet, as much a lot of this stuff is totally verifiable, the bulk of my grandpa's theory is basically pure speculation. He could never really prove it. No one can, I guess, and that's something that haunted him until the day he died. I don't know if I actually believe it either. I mean, as much as it makes for an interesting story, I'm not much on conspiracies, and I'm definitely more inclined to go for Occam's razor when it comes to stuff like this, meaning the simplest and most logical explanation is the one to believe in. But then again, I guess it's just up to you what you believe. I just know that my grandpa was one of the most incredible people I've ever met, and if you really believe that there was something more to the Rogers murders, then there had to be. I just don't know if it goes as deep as being connected to the most infamous conspiracy theory in American history. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. One day, back in June of 1963, a young boy burst into the police department in the small Mexican town of Villagran. He was dehydrated, exhausted, and barely able to stand, having run 15 miles from a nearby village. But just before he passed out, he told a gathering of officers a truly terrifying story. The boy only managed to speak a handful of words, yet their implications were more horrifying than any of the officers could imagine. Group of murderers, seized by ecstasy, gathered to drink human blood. The boy's story was so unsettling that most of the local police dismissed it as a chilling but implausible piece of fantasy. Yet a detective by the name of Luis Martinez had observed that up to 15 different people had gone missing from the area in just a matter of months. As a precaution, Detective Martinez decided to escort the exhausted child back home, and when they arrived, he asked the boy to tell him where he'd last seen those he described as vampires. Detective Martinez was never seen again. Alarmed by the sudden disappearance of their fellow officer, the police in Villagran enlisted the help of the Mexican army in order to scour the area surrounding a town known as Yerba Buena. Upon questioning a number of local townsfolk, the officers heard that some of them had heard terrifying noises coming from a cave system on the eastern outskirts of the town. Some heard screaming, some heard chanting, and many added that a number of townsfolk had gone missing after having wandered too close to the caves. So on May 31st of 1963, officers accompanied by soldiers began to encircle the entrance to the caves, cutting off any route of escape before they commenced their search of the caves themselves. What they found was a vision of hell. The caves outside Yerba Buena had been occupied by a murderous cult, and many of its members chose to die instead of being taken alive. The cave was lined with eldritch shrines, body parts, and rotting corpses, and there was evidence that members of the cult had been partaking in cannibalism. In one chamber, the police found one cult member engaged in the task of carving out the heart of a man he'd recently murdered. When one of the soldiers barked at him to drop the knife, the cult member rushed him, screaming as he waved the knife around and forcing the soldier to shoot him dead. The survivors were rounded up, arrested, then taken to various holding cells in the surrounding towns. Then over the weeks that followed, as more and more of the survivors were questioned, the police began to build up a picture of the cult's origins, as well as the horrifying acts its members had committed. In late 1962, two brothers named Santos and Cayetano Hernandez arrived in Yerba Buena, intent on scamming the locals out of their hard-earned money. Yerba Buena was an impoverished, illiterate place, and many of the villagers were highly superstitious, as well as being firm believers in all things spiritual. So, using a combination of hallucinogenic drugs, violent intimidation, and simple sleight-of-hand magic tricks, the brothers managed to convince the locals that they were the prophets and high priests of the powerful and exalted Inca gods. Once they had gained the unyielding loyalty of up to 50 villagers, they declared that the Inca gods, in exchange for worship and tributes, would grant them hidden treasures in the caves of the mountains surrounding the town, and that they would soon come to claim authority over their ancient kingdom where they would punish the non-believers. Once Santos and Cayetano had moved their loyal followers up to the cave system, they began to exercise a terrifying level of control over them, promising that sordid acts of devotion would bring about the reincarnation of an ancient Inca goddess. For months, the cultists obeyed the brothers' orders without question, but as time went by, and obscene blood rites failed to bring about the arrival of the goddess, they began to grow impatient. The brothers knew that any kind of rebellion would result in them being slaughtered, and so desperate times called for desperate measures. The brothers traveled over 400 miles north to the city of Monterrey and began looking for an escort that they could convince to take part in their scam. And this is how they came across a young woman by the name of Magdalena Solis. Magdalena had just the right kind of charisma the brothers needed to convince the poor and ignorant cultists of her divine nature. And so, after promising to pay her a sizable fee for her few days' work, they took Magdalena back to Yerba Buena and introduced her to the villagers. The cultists were instantly besotted by the beautiful young woman, who was revealed by the Hernandez brother via a fake summoning ritual involving a well-timed screen of colored smoke. Convinced of her authenticity, the cultists set about worshipping Magdalena, waiting on her hand and foot, and by the time the brothers were due to drive her back to Monterrey, Magdalena had gone completely rogue. She was playing the part of goddess far too well, exercising complete control over the cultists' every action, and she refused to leave the cave system when the Hernandez brothers offered to drive her home. At first, the brothers tried offering Magdalena more money, just to leave the camp, but she still refused. They then attempted to forcefully remove her, but Magdalena's screams had her loyal cultists rallying to her cause. It was then that the brothers realized something terrifying. Magdalena wasn't just acting like she was the living embodiment of the goddess Coatlicue. She seemed to genuinely believe that was the case. As it turned out, Magdalena had a history of sadistic narcotism and rampant delusion that predated her meeting with the Hernandez brothers, and she was already teetering on the brink of the psychotic abyss when she agreed to take the job. But night after night of drug-fueled ritual and intoxicating power had pushed her completely over the edge, into a deep and disturbing madness. After that, the reality was clear. Just as the cultists were once slaves to the Hernandez brothers were now slaves to Magdalena, the high priestess of blood. Magdalena's reign over the cult was even more brutal and sadistic than that of the brothers, and after weeks of absolute horror and depravity, loyalties were beginning to wane. But then, one couple expressed a desire to leave the cult. Those still fiercely loyal to Magdalena informed the Hernandez brothers, who were then acting as their goddess's lieutenants-in-chief. Fearing the butchery of their order be exposed, the brothers sought Magdalena's permission to execute the apostates. Drunk with power, Magdalena ordered that the couple would be publicly executed, and after being seized by their fellow cultists, They had their throats cut and their hearts carved out to the jubilance of the congregation. After that, the victims' bodies were completely drained of blood, and the cultists took gulping mouthfuls of it from a ceremonial cup. The gory executions made the cultists thirst for more ritual blood, and over the weeks that followed, dozens of non-believing villagers were kidnapped, tortured, and sacrificed in Magdalena's name. In one instance, a villager was lured up towards the caves by a family member who had been missing for weeks after pledging her loyalty to her living goddess. The cult then stalked the man through the forest, beat him unconscious, then dragged him back to the cave system to be ceremonially sacrificed. The cultists cut off the man's hands and feet, cauterizing the gushing wounds to keep him alive for as long as possible. Then, piece by piece, they sliced up, mutilated, then drained him of his blood. From there, the victim's blood was mixed with peyote, a kind of cactus which produces psychedelic effects when dried and consumed. This meant that when the throng of cultists drank the blood, they fell into a violent state of hallucinogenic frenzy, which further cemented their loyalty to their goddess. It went on and on for 6 weeks, torturing victims for days at a time before taking their lives in one of the worst ways imaginable. It's believed that around 15 different people were sacrificed in this way, all before a teenage boy stumbled across the ritual site. 14-year-old Sebastian Guerrero was so completely terrified by what he'd witnessed at the caves that he ran almost non-stop for 15 miles in order to alert the nearest law enforcement. After a trial that sent shockwaves through neighboring communities, Magdalena Solis was sentenced to 50 years in prison, while the cultists not loyal enough to die for her were handed around 30 years each. One of the more shocking details that emerged in the trial was that the man being sacrificed at the time of the police raid was actually one of the Hernandez brothers. When it became apparent that the cult's days were numbered, one of the cultists set about murdering one of the brothers with the intention of harvesting their organs. The idea was, if the cultists escaped, they could consume a high priest's organs and thus restart the cult after manifesting their powers. As news of the murders spilled into newspapers across the country, the Mexican public found themselves in disbelief that such a nightmarish thing could have occurred. Since then, the village of Yerba Buena has tried to move on from the hellish murders that were committed in the nearby caves, but to some, the jagged rock walls of the Yerba Buena caves will forever be stained with the blood of the innocent. Back when I was a beat cop in Ogden, I worked under a lieutenant who, back when he was a homicide detective, had come up with the genius technique that caught the hi-fi murderers. Given that the incident had occurred back in the 70s, I was only vaguely aware of the hi-fi murders. Then one time when we were sharing a few beers after a shift, one of my buddies decided to share the story with me. This was way back before Google or anything like that, and if you wanted to read news archives, you had to head down to a library to dig through their collection of slides. So mostly it was a case of you either knew about something or you didn't. But as well as telling me exactly how those guys were caught, my buddy told me about all the murders themselves. And that story is probably one of the most nightmare-inducing things I've ever heard. Back in 1974, 3 serving members of the U.S. Air Force drove over to this hi-fi store in Ogden, Utah. Hi-fi systems were still pretty cutting edge at the time, and the Air Force guys intended to rob the place before making tens of thousands of dollars offloading their loot. They hit the place just before closing time, tied up the 2 young employees on duty, then led them down into the basement. And when I say young, I mean really young, as in I'm pretty sure that they were both still teenagers at the time, and they must have been terrified. The gang then set about unloading all the hi-fi equipment into their vans they'd pulled up in when, for some reason, the 16-year-old kid walks right into the door and interrupts them. This ends in the kid also being taken prisoner, and I imagine by that point, the robbers are getting pretty anxious because their plan is starting to unravel and that they had 3 prisoners to keep an eye on, not just 1 or 2. Not long after, the employees' parents started getting worried that their kids hadn't arrived home yet, so 2 more people show up at the store. They're both taken prisoner, and now the gang are literally outnumbered by the number of prisoners they have to keep in check. What happens next is the part that really confuses me, as there was no reason why one of the robbers couldn't have just kept a gun pointed at the prisoners while the other 2 loaded up their van with sound equipment. Sure, the robbery hadn't gone exactly as planned, but I'll never understand what possessed them to do what they did next. One of the robbers goes out to their van, brings back some kind of bottle, and starts pouring the contents into plastic cups. He then tells the hostages that it's some kind of liquor laced with sleeping pills, and all drinking it will do is knock them out for a while so they can complete their robbery. The thing is, it wasn't liquor. It was drain cleaner. Really strong drain cleaner too that burned their throats and tongues and caused the skin on their lips to peel and blister. To stop them from puking the drain cleaner back up, the robbers then tried to duct tape their prisoner's mouth shut, presumably in the hopes that drinking the drain cleaner would just kill them so there wouldn't be any witnesses. But because the skin around their mouths were melting off, the duct tape wouldn't hold in their puke or their screams, so all 5 prisoners started convulsing, screaming, puking up drain cleaner, and it must have been an absolute horror show. Realizing their mistake, the robbers then just started shooting their prisoners, leaving only an 18-year-old girl alive so that one of them could do terrible things to her before shooting her in the head. One of the survivors said that he'd heard her last words before she was shot, and they were a whimpered, "I'm too young to die." After that, the robbers noticed that one of their prisoners, who was one of the employees' fathers, had survived being shot. So, to finish him off, one of the robbers rams a ballpoint pen into the guy's ear, then stomps on it until it's somehow ripped out of his throat. And of all the messed up details I heard that night while staring into my bottle of Falstaff, that's the one that sticks with me the most. When they were done doing that, the robbers finished up loading the hi-fi equipment into their van, then drove off somewhere to stash it. The bodies were found by one of the employees' other parents just a few hours later, and I can't imagine she ever got over what she saw that day. Son dead, husband with a pen sticking out of his throat. The way I see it, those thugs ruined just as many lives as they took that day, and the scars on the survivor's face from the drain cleaner meant that they were reminded of it every single time they looked in the mirror. The cops were clued into the fact that the killers were airmen just a few hours after the crime, as the timing of it meant that it was all over local TV channels' evening news broadcasts. One of the killers had actually told an Air Force buddy of theirs that they were planning on robbing that particular hi-fi store. So boom, the first tip came in almost right away. That's where my old lieutenant comes in too, because he was one of the homicide detectives who was assigned to the case. He and his partner figured that since the guys were in the Air Force, they might have been staying at the base just outside of town. So, they drive over, tell the base's commanding officer what they're there for, then get his permission to assemble all the airmen in the mess hall or whatever. My old lieutenant's plan was to basically show them all a bunch of pictures of the victims, then watch all the airmen's faces to see if anyone exhibited any suspicious behavior. So, that's what he and his partner did. They showed all the airmen pictures of the victims, then talked in detail about what had happened to them, all the gritty details included. From what I was told, almost all of the airmen just stared, open mouthed, as my old lieutenant told them about the drain cleaner, about the assault, and about the whole pen being stomped into the guy's ear. But among the crowd were 2 or 3 airmen who just kept looking around all nervous, glancing over at one another in a way the detectives found extremely suspicious. After the little presentation was over, the guys who acted suspicious were singled out and had their barracks searched. There, the cops found flyers for the hi-fi shop which listed its opening times as well as some kind of rental receipt for a storage unit back in town. The unit was searched and, what do you know, the hi-fi equipment was there. And this was all the evidence they needed to arrest all 3 of the guys on suspicion of robbery and attempted murder. I know 2 of the killers, after confessing that they were involved in some of the violence, were executed by lethal injection. Apparently, they got the idea to use Drain Killer to kill people after watching some Clint Eastwood movie, and the pair of them found Jesus before they were actually put to death. Turns out the third guy didn't actually hurt anyone. He was just there for the whole thing, and this was corroborated by the other two, who I guess wanted to save him from the death penalty. Well, it worked. And the third guy, this 19-year-old kid who had no idea what he had gotten into, he gets something like a decade in prison before he's finally released. He moves to Oklahoma, back in with his folks, then just tries going about living a whole new life. But then, get this. When the kid, who I suppose wasn't a kid anymore, hears about his two buddies getting executed back in Utah, then decides that he has to go too. And by that I mean he puts a bullet through his head maybe a week or so after they're killed. I guess it was a combination of not being able to live with the guilt of what he'd been a part of, then maybe a little survivor's guilt that he dodged the death penalty while his buddies didn't. That whole detail is the final disturbing twist on what had to be one of the most messed up cases I'd ever heard of. And as much as it would have been cool to have the same kind of freedom and creativity that detectives get to operate with, thinking about having to deal with stuff like that makes me glad that I never got into homicide. I was one of the detectives at the Mad Chopper murder incident back in 1978. Single worst thing I'd ever investigated. It involved a 15-year-old girl named Mary Vincent who was hitchhiking back to Vegas after visiting family over in California. A guy pulled over when she was hitchhiking in Modesto, gained her trust, and drove her into the middle of nowhere before subjecting her to some of the worst torture imaginable. The guy beat her with a sledgehammer and violated her all night. Then before he tossed her body off of a 30-foot cliff, he cut her arms off with a machete in the hopes that she'd just bleed out. The guy then drives off, thinking the girl is dead. Only she isn't dead. She wakes up, then does some of the craziest stuff I've ever heard in my whole life. She sticks the bleeding stumps that used to be her arms in a pool of mud, as it was all she could think of to stop the bleeding. It actually works, and as the mud dries, it actually stemmed the blood flow enough to keep her from bleeding to death. She then walked 3 times, completely without clothes and with no arms, before she eventually reaches a highway where a passing driver got her some help. We worked with that young lady for months, and I swear to God she was the bravest girl I'd ever known. The guy had intended to kill her, torture her for hours, then made an invalid of her. Anyone else might have been too afraid or traumatized to be of any use to the investigation, but she was invaluable. She was so determined to get justice for herself that she later said it gave her a kind of calm. I guess the idea of revenge just kept her going, kept all the dark thoughts at bay. In the end, we arrested a guy named Larry Singleton, and after her testimony helped secure a conviction, we all figured the guy would get upwards of 20 years in prison. Then, the judge only gave him 14. We were disappointed, and that's putting it mildly, because the way Singleton acted all throughout his trial, we knew he was a natural-born killer. He was cold, totally remorseless, and if he got another chance, we had no doubt he'd kill again. Singleton went to prison in 1979, and over the next 20 years or so, the case faded into the background. We couldn't forget it, and that goes for my partner too. We were haunted by it, and all the times we met up for drinks after we retired from the force, the subject of the Mad Chopper always came up at some point. He used to imagine it too, said he'd see little Mary Vincent when he closed his eyes at night, running through the dark, mud all over her stumps, even though he'd never even seen it to begin with. Then come 1997, what do you know? I get a call from my ex-partner telling me to expect an envelope in the mail. It arrived a few days later, and when I opened it, all it contained was a newspaper clipping from a Florida newspaper. It said none other than Larry Singleton had been arrested for the murder of a mother of 3. Thank God for Florida, because a judge down there gave Larry the death sentence. He ended up missing his execution though, and I read how he died of cancer in prison just a few months after 9/11. You ask me, he should have been put out of his misery much earlier, preferably before he took poor Mary Vincent's arms off. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, do.